your involvement with the preservation of environment?
Yeah, we can. I mean,
What is the journey? How long you've been actively taking part?
yeah. Well, I mean, the single prerogative that every human being that we have a responsibility to protect the world around us and to preserve the world around us. We have a responsibility to all future generations to create a sustainable civilization in our lifetimes. Because if we don't do it in our lifetimes, then we're dealing with catastrophic runaway tipping points that are really going to be an existential threat for future generations. And when the writing is already on the wall that we're dealing with significant global catastrophe, environmental catastrophe, and we need to turn this ship around very quickly. So I understood this fairly 20 years ago, like fairly early on. And then of course when Al Gore came out and started telling the story of the inconvenient truth, which is unrestrained economic growth has its limitations. And the classic issue in the management of countries is, say, in the world of Renars, there's a 1 million hectare forest, and we chop down that 500,000 hectares, and we produce toilet paper and toothpicks, and we create employment and we create jobs, and then the GDP for that year for the country looks amazing because that 1 million hectares as an asset was not on the books to start with. It was just like this resource that could be exploited, like it was somehow continuously renewable. And that's the concept. The concept of sustainability is that whatever that we're creating it from a resource that can be continuously renewed. And at the moment we are living beyond our means, and it's a significant issue to challenge. And so I studied carbon management in 2012. So carbon management is one way of accounting for the release of carbon dioxide or what's called a CO2 equivalent into the atmosphere.
And there's like kind of an international ruling by that as well, that countries shouldn't exceed the level of carbon emissions. When I started business, I did quality management, and it was ISO 9001, yes. And that was specifically for Europe. And there was, I think we touched about this question. And then if certain country exceed that, then they're going to get some kind of penalties and things like that. How well is it organized in the world? Like, do they actually maintain that you're not going to go over it, or?
Well, international law is complex because there aren't very strong enforcement mechanisms in place. So for instance, there's almost all the countries in the world, with a few exceptions, are a signatory to the Charter of Human Rights, the Covenant of Civil, Political and Social Rights, the Covenant of Economic Rights, and so on, the rights of the child. But there are no enforcement mechanisms in the event that, say, Sudan, who is a signatory, if they breach those covenants, there's no one that's going to come and knock on their door. There can be individual sanctions that either the United Nations can rule sanctions, and that's very rare. Individual countries can put pressure on countries to turn things around. But basically, part of the international order of things is that countries have sovereignty is one of the main principles between nations, that no nation can tell me what I should be doing within my borders. And of course, after we had the situation in Yugoslavia, we had the situation in Rwanda, where what was happening inside of those borders were disastrous. And Kofi Annan, who was the Secretary General of the United Nations in 2000, said we accept sovereignty, national sovereignty, but what about the responsibility to protect? And so then the doctrine of responsibility to protect was developed, which was basically legalized invading a country.
Wow.
So in the instance that a country cannot look after its own people, they're spilling over into international borders. Their neighbors have offered them help. They've rejected that help. It's creating a regional disaster. They're using government resources to harm civilians unreasonably. en masse, and then there's a point in time where governments can reasonably sanction warfare. So that's what happened when NATO bombed Libya. So Libya. So there was an advance from Tripoli onto the country, the city in the east. I can't remember now. And then the French-led NATO forces went and bombed Libya, and that was done with a certain sanction from the United Nations.
So just going a little bit back about, so if there's one specific country or countries who really exceed that carbon emission, so there's no actual international law where they would other countries come together and say, listen, you guys, you shouldn't be polluting our environment, or so there's no restrictions whatsoever.
Well, there is no international law. Not really. I mean, there is there's some heads of state have been brought to trial at the International Criminal Court, and there's what's called Just Kogan's crimes, which is 5 different categories of crimes against humanity, where individuals who are led armies, for instance, can be charged. So a former military general in Serbian general was charged, for instance, and put on trial in The Hague. So those are individual cases, but like enforcement is one of the great challenges, and basically, unless you write that international law into your own national legislation, it's not really a law.
Wow.
And like if you agree, for instance, if Australia agrees that the Great Barrier Reef under UNESCO is a World Heritage Site, for instance, and there's certain things that you can and cannot do, well, they go and do all of those things, and there is no enforcement mechanism that's going to come in and tell them off or
as you mentioned about the reef. Like I just recently went to Nusa Penida, which is 45 minutes on a boat from Bali, and I didn't see myself, but I heard these stories when the locals they use explosives for fishing, and then destroy the local coral reefs, and then there's so many like expats who are very passionate about it, and they come in and like, why do you guys do this? Like, can we stop this? And the locals, well, why not? This is how we've been doing this for years, or this is our land. Who are you here to tell us what to do?
Yeah, and I think the answer to that is, you're a global citizen, and in a world without borders, we really need to strive for a more mature humanity. But you're quite right.
And that was one of the things. What is one of your missions? Yeah. It's about striving for a more mature humanity, which I love that concept.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question of what a more mature humanity would look like. I mean, I travel with the Balinese spiritual master as his translator as a fluent Indonesian speaker in the late 90s through England for 3 months. And so we were in England for the end of the turn of the millennium. And so we all kind of made a wish for humanity that came to him, and you could wish for peace or joy or happiness or peace on earth and all these beautiful things, and his wish was for more mature humanity.
That's an amazing point.
And that's just stayed with me for most of my adult life. Actually, it's been really powerful, because it begs the question, what would a more mature humanity look like? And the answer to that question can continue to evolve through your own life, which is, all good questions. The answers can continue to evolve as we grow, and the answers are in many ways less important than just really treasuring.